Brothels closed down, the police force was laid off because crime went so low, Bible sales skyrocketed throughout the nation. This is the story of the Welsh Revival and its leader, Evan Roberts. I'm Robert Sladen, and this is God's Generals. The evangelicals and the Pentecostal movements have all valued the great story of the Welsh Revival. It is one of the most exciting revivals that I have read about and studied in all of my years of reading all the great leaders in the revival movements. And that's what we're going to talk about today, is how God chose a young man named Evan Roberts. He was in his 20s when God chose him. So you don't have to be a doctor of theology or have all the experience or come from the right type of family. You have to just have the right heart, and God will use you. And many of you have the right heart, but sometimes you've heard, well, you don't have this education, it didn't come from that church. That means nothing. God responds to the heart condition of a man or of a woman. Evan Roberts was born in Wales. His family worked in the coal mines like he did as a young man himself. He was known as he'd go into the coal mines. You know, back in those days, there was no child labor law, so children and teenagers worked like adult men worked in the mines. And so he would carry his Bible with him and go down into the mines, and during their breaks, he would read the scriptures, and during the lunchtime, he'd read his scriptures, and he'd make a little place in the wall of the mine and left his Bible in there sometimes. Well, one time there was an explosion, and the explosion burnt the pages of his Bible and became the famous Scorch Bible that he would use throughout his life and throughout the revival that was to come. So Evan Roberts, to look at his life, is very interesting. His family was Christian, and so they grew up teaching the Bible stories and going to church, but Evan Roberts took it a step further. He seemed to have a personal relationship with God that did not have to come via the pastor or via his parents. He had it one for himself. And it was so intense at times, people would notice him walking down the roads to going to school or going home or going to the store. And he would just stop on the side of the road and he would just talk to himself. It looked like he was talking to the air. And folks walking by or in horse and buggy or some of the early cars, but mainly horse and buggy, they would look at this young man, talking to himself, and they thought there was something wrong with him. So his parents had him taken to a special doctor to find out if there was. And the doctor came back and said that Evan Roberts had a religious fixation about him, that he would grow out of it in time. Well, I don't think his religious fixation ever stopped. It grew bigger and bigger and bigger. And I don't think they should have thought there was a problem because of the young man stopping and talking to God. If young men would talk to God more, they would not be talking to the wrong people. So Evan Roberts is also a young man that influenced his friends. Now I think when you study the life of him, especially his early years, his friendships are important to consider. We are all influenced by who we hang around, who we talk with, who we are asking questions of, and their reactions to our conversations and our activities. And Evan Roberts was one of those. If you couldn't find him at school, you couldn't find him at home, you might find him playing sports with his friend, but most likely you would find him at church or doing something around his home church of Moriah Chapel. And so he was off at a revival meeting, and one of his friends had gone with him to attend this meeting, and it was time for them to pray. And so they all got on their knees by the pew where they were at, and some walked forward to the front of the church as the service was coming to an end. In those days, people were invited to come to the altar and pray, and that's how they would end the service. In our days, we usually sing with a happy song, and we leave with a shout, and we leave the service that way. In those days, they actually prayed the end of the service. And Evan Roberts knelt down, and the Spirit of God came on him and spoke to him and showed him that there was coming a great revival to Wales, and he was going to be a part of that great revival. And in this vision and this visitation, God said to him that over 100,000 souls would come to him in a short amount of time. So when this vision ended, he came out of it, and he turned to his friend and said, "Do you believe that God can give us 100,000 souls in Wales?" And his friend said, "Yes." Now, to me, I'm so glad that he had a friend that went, "Yes." What would your friend say? Would your friend say, "I don't think so," and give you all the reasons why this cannot happen? It reminds me in the scriptures about Daniel and his three friends. When the king was going to kill all the wise men because they couldn't interpret his dream, then Daniel said, "Give me some time." He leaves the king's throne room and goes to his friends and says, "We've got to pray." And all of them get together and pray and get an answer. Thank God that we can have those kind of friends, and Evan Roberts did too. He goes back to his home church of Moriah Chapel, asked the pastor if he could have a youth meeting after the Sunday morning service. Well, mainly adults showed up and 1 or 2 youth showed up. And in this youth meeting of about 14 people, he expressed what God had said to him, and he prayed this famous prayer, "O Lord, bend us, O Lord." And that was the prayer that began to ignite the Spirit of God in the heart of man in Wales. And from this little revival service, or this little youth meeting, sprung the revival meetings. And it began to grow, it began to increase, to where it affected the nations. And now, 100 and some years later, we still admire it, we still love it. When I come back, we're going to talk about the great happenings of the Welsh Revival. I've always enjoyed reading about what happened in the Welsh Revival, what went right, what went wrong. The Welsh Revival began, as I said, in a youth meeting at Mariah Chapel. And thank God the pastor was not one of those that was scared to give one of his young men an opportunity to share his heart, and when he recognized that God was doing something, to support it. So many ministers today control so much that it would take an act of Congress, as my grandma used to say, for God to get through the door of the church. But at least in Mariah Chapel, on this time period in the early 1900s, the pastor said yes to Evan Roberts, and the revival began to start. When the testimonies began to roll, the crowds began to come and fill up, because they heard about a promise that God was going to visit the little nation of Wales. And as it began to spark and begin to happen, all groups, young and old, came, and they would come into a service. And here's how the revival meetings were like. They were conducted this way. Evan Roberts was not really wanting to be the star. He said about himself, "I want to be the window that you look through to see God. Don't look at me, look through me, or look at who I'm pointing at." So one of his great characteristics that helped the beginning of the revival, which also became a weakness of a revival, is he didn't want to be the great star of it, but yet you need to be a leader of it. And so there's a great waltz you have to have between not wanting to be the star, but yet still taking the position that God gave you. And Evan Roberts found that in the beginning, and began to be used to become a catalyst of the great flow of the Spirit. When he would come to the service, he may preach, he may not preach. He'd normally sit on the side of the platform, or he'd be off in the pastor's office, off the side of the auditorium space, and the crowd would fill up. Sometimes outside the doors, onto the sidewalks. They'd open the windows of the chapels, and so the folks outside could hear. And they would come and they would sit quietly, and then there would be little weepings or cryings or a little rumble of people praying. And they were not always waiting for Evan to show up, even though that was in the room, but the people came already prepared to talk to God for themselves. And at times there would become loud weepings and cryings, and then there would come people would just stand up and start singing songs that they knew, or songs out of their spirit. Other times they would stand up 2 or 3 and sing songs together. And so there was a lot of freedom in the Welsh Revival to allow the people to respond to the unction and the spontaneity of the Spirit as it came on them and moved through them. If Evan Roberts would come into the room, like I said, he would sit here. He may grace the pulpit and stand up there and talk for 5 minutes or 10 minutes. He was not a very long-winded preacher. He may not preach at all. He may get up and stand behind the pulpit and start to pray and then disappear behind it. And all you would think, well, he was there and now he's behind the pulpit praying. You could hear his voice. He may be behind the pulpit praying for the next hour and get up and walk off and walk out and leave the crowd. And so it was not your normal American or British style of doing church. It was a flow of the Spirit, and that Evan Roberts was being led by the Spirit the best that he knew. Now, some of the great happenings in the revival, besides the great salvations, is that when you read and research the move of God in Wales, here are some statistics. During the time of the Welsh Revival, which is began in 1902, 3, and 4, in that time period, and then begin to kind of slide down or begin to decline. During the time of its height, there was policemen were laid off of the police force because crime went so low. Drunkenness statistically went down because people quit drinking. They went to church and drank the new wine, not the old wine. Also, the Bible Society recorded that they had a record number of orders for Bibles, and to several years after the revival ended, they were still filling the orders to print Bibles that were ordered during the revival. And so those are a few things. Now, here are some things that I enjoy when I read about the Welsh Revival. I love the story about the picked ponies in the coal mines. When the revival hit so strong in Wales, and Wales is mainly a coal mining type of a country, that the coal miners quit cussing. And you know, when you're not born again, you'd say all what you want to say. You use profanity. And the ponies, they don't know bad words from good words. All they know was that sound meant go and the other sound meant stop. And so when the coal miners got saved, or as a newspaper said, when the coal miners got religion, they quit cussing. And the little ponies got confused because the coal miner wouldn't say damn to go or say something else for it to stop. And so the little ponies got all confused, and the coal mine companies had to go out and buy a whole new herd of horses and train them on how to carry the coal out and bring the cart back down. And so to me, that was so exciting to know that the revival had affected the ponies, and they didn't know what to do because the coal miners quit cussing. The other thing that I find very intriguing about the Welsh revival was during the time every year, like every nation does, is that we have sports events. In America, we have the World Series, we have the Super Bowl, and in America we call it soccer. In Europe, we call it football. And so in Wales, during the time of the revival, they didn't have a Super Bowl or a World Cup for their nation. When you read in 1901 who won the football game, who won the big tournament, and then you get down to the year of the revival, and then it's written in the name where you should put the name of the team that won, and it just says revival. There was no tournament because everybody was going to church and having a religious experience. Now that's like saying in America that we didn't have a Super Bowl because everybody was going to church and more concerned about God and the condition of their soul than they were about the Super Bowl. That would be a big event. The other great thing about the Welsh revival was that the business hours in the nation changed. When no one's shopping, why keep the store open? When no one is going to the restaurants, why keep it open? The business hours of Wales during the time of the revival changed because business concluded early, because no one was buying or selling or doing business. They were going home, getting dressed, going to church, and maybe be there to midnight or 2 or 3 o'clock and then start again. Can you imagine in America or in London or in Berlin that all of a sudden a move of God comes and the business hours of the whole nation changes to accommodate the people wanting to go to church and wanting to be around God and wanting to be moved by the moving of the Spirit in their own soul? That's what happened in Wales. These are just a few stories that shows you the impact. The young people were involved, the children were involved, the elderly were involved. There was over 100 preachers that we know of that was being used by God all over Wales at one time. So it was not just around Evan Roberts' personality, even though he was the leader. He's the one that God chose to be the catalyst. But there was at least 100 people, 100 ministers that were being used all over Wales. In a couple of minutes, we're going to be letting you hear the only voice recording of Evan Roberts. It is a rare piece of church history. I'm so glad I found it. It was almost lost to the decay of time, but it was reconstructed and put together. In a few moments, you're going to get to hear the Welsh revivalist himself speak as he did during the time of the revival.
Dymagariad fel y moroedd, tostwriaethau fel yr llu, tywysog bawyd piran marw, marwy brani'n bawyd i. Pwy all baidio chofio amdano, pwy all baidio drathu'r glwd, dyma dyfn de mawr, Dorodd ar gaiau nefoedd, oedd yn gafain hyd yn awr. Gros y chariad megis delw, yn ymdywach dyma'n hyd, a chafiam dy pira heddwch, yn cysani aiog His love vast as the ocean, loving kindness as the cloud. When the breeze of life on ransom shed over us His precious blood, who this love will not remember, who can cease to sing His praise? He can never be forgotten throughout His eternal days.
On the Mount of Crucifixion.